Welcome to the Indie Pub, a laid-back interview show dedicated to the world of self and indie publishing. I'm your host, Jay Rushing, author of the self-published fantasy noir novel Radio, and a beverage buff with a passion for deep dives and good times. Each episode, a guest will step into the pub with a publishing-related topic and a favorite drink for us to explore and enjoy. Whether you want to sharpen your craft, snag a new cocktail recipe, or just have a laugh, there's always a seat and a full glass waiting for you at the Indie Pub. Welcome to the Indie Pub. Our guest today is Scott Drakeford, whose debut epic fantasy novel Rise of the Mages has had a spectacular launch as of late. But, dear listeners, our guest is also traditionally published. Now, please, unclutch those pearls, set down those pitchforks. When two roads diverge in a paper woods, do authors have a decision to make? Traditional or self/indie publishing, and it's vital to make an informed decision. Scott is here to give us some insight into what the traditional publishing track is actually like for a new author. So, Scott, before we dive in, tell us a bit about what we're drinking here in the pub.
We've got just straight Laphroaig Select with ice on my end. I'm guessing you've got it neat, but I don't know.
I do. I have the 10 neat.
Yeah.
But Laphroaig, it's always so nice.
Yeah. I actually haven't had this in quite some time. It was still taped from when we moved in 2019. If I go smoky, it's usually Lagavulin 16. That's my favorite. And I don't know actually how to say this. Cull-Ela, or however you say that.
I think it's
12.
Yes, that's delicious. I think it's Koila.
Yeah.
I think, but I could be completely wrong. So
yeah,
if you are Scottish and you know.
You've been to Scotland more recently and probably more times than I have.
Oh, Scotland's one of my favorite places. So yeah, I get there as often as I can.
Yeah, I'm glad we went with a Scotch though, because right when my wife and I left the religion that we grew up in and got a little more comfortable with drinking alcohol here and there is right when we went to Scotland. And we went to Scotland mostly because Kaylee, my wife, has family in England that we wanted to visit, and we wanted them to meet our daughter, but also because she had been watching Outlander and reading the books. And so we were like, hey, let's go check it out. It looks cool. And, there's some history up there. But along the way, I got to stop at a few distilleries and got to ride the whatever boat it is on I guess it's Loch Ness, right? Yeah, Loch Ness I think we went to, and they had a little tasting bar there, and I got to try a few there and at some hotels. So yeah, it was cool.
Nice. Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and your work? So I'm going to let out some secrets here, right? Personal secrets that aren't super secret. I publish under the name Scott Drakeford, but my real name is Scott Smith. I publish under the name Scott Drakeford because there is already a Scott Smith actively publishing. He's a thriller writer, and I think he has a few screenplays to his credit as well. So both my agent who really likes Scott Smith, the thriller writer, and my publisher said, yeah, it'd be better to avoid that confusion. And I've had significant name confusion. Pull your credit report and some other person with your name and birthday comes up, you've got a common name. So anyway, that's why I publish under a pseudonym, and I chose Drakeford because it's a family name on my dad's side. My grandpa's name on my paternal side was Gordon Drakeford Smith, that came from his mom, who was so I guess my great grandmother was a Drakeford from somewhere in England. Nice. And it sounded suitably fantasy. So yeah.
Yeah. I had some, I think it was Zach Argyle, actually, an indie published fellow. He said, have we talked about how unfair it is that you're a fantasy author with the name Drake, with the word Drake in your name? And I was like, yeah, I kind of cheated on that one, but I'll take it. But yeah, so that's me. I grew up reading pretty mainstream fantasy fiction and some sci-fi, and that mainstream taste has kind of stuck, I suppose. And 11 years ago now, I decided I wanted to start creating, and writing was the most natural outlet for that because I had read so much and I love books so much. And I decided to write Rise of the Mages. It was called Ire, just Ire, for a very long time. But my publisher felt strongly about a more marketable title, so it is Rise of the Mages. And it's a story about two brothers that are at a school called the Citadel. I kind of modeled the Citadel after our modern day universities, where you find a smattering of different subjects, but in particular I honed in on engineering, since that was a big part of my university experience, and magic. Well, I guess not magic, engineering with the power source that ends up being a magic source as well, but also military arts as kind of a symbol of modern day sports, as kind of a fill-in for, I guess, deadly arts or war or what have you. I don't know that it's a perfect fill-in, but anyway, yeah. So that's the story. Somebody attacks their school. The brother who studies military arts has to rescue the engineering whiz brother who gets captured in the attack. And that's the basis of the story.
All right, so jumping into our topic for today, there are lots and lots of routes into the world of indie publishing and self-publishing, and a lot of those are pretty visible, or at least easily researchable. But when it comes to traditional publishing, aside from the front door, which is often finding an agent, after that, things in the process can get a little bit fuzzy. So can you give us just a rundown on what your experience has been kind of from getting that agent through the process? What did that process kind of look like step by step?
Yeah, and I think talking about getting an agent is very worthwhile too, because as you mentioned, that's kind of the first door to get through, and that's certainly not the only door to get through. And I'll talk about that. I'll try to go more or less chronologically. Do you want me to start with why I decided to go after an agent in that, or just talk about the process and then we'll get into other stuff later?
Let's do the process now. We'll definitely get into the whys and hows later on.
Cool. So the first step, right, is to finish a book.
Yep.
For debuts, they won't take on anybody unless you have a finished work to show them. I suppose there are a few exceptions. I've heard that just recently a major publisher, my publisher, bought a book on basically just a few sample chapters and an outline. And it's a large book, and I don't think it was a small deal. I'm not really sure, but they're talking about it enough that it seems like it wasn't a super small deal. But anyway, so yeah, write a book is the first step. And then it's on to getting an agent. The typical method of getting an agent is just cold querying, right? Sending a query letter. Every agent has their format. I'm sure most people know this. But what I think is worth discussing is how to make a personal connection and how that might be helpful, right? So I read about other authors doing that, and then I tried that, and my agent at least claims that made a difference. I don't know whether it really did or not, but he says he remembered me when I queried. But also, I think the biggest thing to mention is, and I think you and I and our little writing group that we've belonged to for a few years have talked about this at least a little bit. It really is a function of a lot of luck, but that luck has a lot to do with personal taste and style, right? Mm-hmm. So you kind of just have to hope that there's an agent out there that shares your personal tastes in a lot of different areas, really. What you're writing about, how you write it, who you are. Are they looking for diverse only, that kind of thing, which is happening here and there, and I think it's a good thing where it's happening. But yeah, so I think there are a lot of things that people don't take into account, both when they're looking for the right agent to query, but also when they're judging their results, right? Like, I think a lot of people are like, oh man, I sent out 50 query letters and all of them were rejections or whatever. There's just so much that goes into it, especially when it comes to something as subjective as art. If they ate a bad burrito that day, you're hosed,
Yeah.
and maybe and maybe that was the only guy or person that shares some of your tastes. I got very lucky in that I found an agent, and I don't think I knew this to the extent I do now when I queried, but I found an agent who likes pretty traditional fantasy, right? And my book is fairly traditional in a lot of its themes. I tried to kind of marry traditional adventure quest fantasy with some, more modern aspects, like very tech heavy and very quickly paced. I really enjoy Pierce Brown's Red Rising and Bernard Cornwell and a lot of books like that have really quick pacing and throw in some deeper stuff along the way. So I tried to model that in my writing as well. But anyway, I mean, it just kind of turns out Matt Bialer, my agent, shares that, right? Like I look at his list, and at least most of them are that pretty traditional fantasy writer, right? Not a whole lot of I guess not a lot of urban fantasy, although there is some in his catalog. But his biggest ones are traditional. So the story of how I did it, I right around when I thought I was finishing my book, I was about 80% done with my manuscript and convinced that I could finish it within a few months. And spoiler alert, I didn't. But I was around 80% done, and Kaylee and I, my wife, wanted to take our first trip to the UK to visit her family. She, her grandma and aunt and uncle and cousins that live there. So and there was it was a World Fantasy Convention in 2013 coming up that year, and so we said, hey, let's book a trip, and we'll see some of London, we'll see Bearstead, where my wife's family is from, and then we'll go down to that conference for a few days, right? And I did that for a few reasons. I was excited about it, at least for a few reasons, not least of which was that at least two agents on my list of top agents were going to be there. Matt Bialer, who represents Pat Rothfuss, who I had just read around then and was a big fan. And then Joshua Bilmez, and I hope I get that pronunciation right, who represents Brandon Sanderson, who, I'm originally from Utah. He's a very big name there and now elsewhere. But so those two I kind of had an eye on, and I knew there'd be a few others. And I figured that I would be one of relatively few Americans there who wasn't already an agented writer, right? I figured not a whole lot would bother to fly across the pond to a convention in the UK just to meet an agent, right? So it worked out fairly well. I had the chance to catch Joshua after one of his panels, and he had mentioned that he really likes artisan chocolates, and my dad happens to be an artisan chocolatier.
Nice.
So I got to talk to him about that, and I was on the cusp of sending to him as well. He was near the top of my list, as was Jennifer Jackson, who represents Jim Butcher, and a few others. And a lot of these newer, really prominent agents just weren't around then, or at least not on my radar. It was 10, 11, 12 years ago, right? But anyway, so I went and I caught Matt actually outside of a Pat Rothfuss reading. He read like a poem and a story that I think is now part of an anthology about Bast and a lightning tree or something like that. I can't really remember. It's been a long time. But Matt was just out in the foyer outside the room, and I approached him super awkwardly. I was super nervous, and I knew that Matt had become aware of Pat Rothfuss when Rothfuss had won the Writers of the Future contest. And so I asked Matt, I was like, hey, do I need to win or place in Writers of the Future to, pique your interest or to submit to you? And he just laughed and he was like, no, not at all. Like that apparently didn't matter much to him. It just happened to be the route that, Pat took. And he handed me his card and he was like, go ahead and submit when you're ready. And that was October 2013. I didn't submit to him until, man, I don't even remember what month, but it was in 2015 that I submitted to him. He responded quick and said, hey, I got this. And if I don't respond in 8 weeks, hit me up again. I didn't hear from him for 8 weeks, and that was pretty agonizing. Yeah. And then 8 weeks rolled around, and I hit him up again, and I said, hey, you said to check in, and I definitely want to work with you. But I had sent him an exclusive query just because I felt like I had few enough agents I was super stoked about. I had like 3 to 5 that I was really excited about. I had few enough that I figured I might as well take my time and try to attract a little extra attention, I guess, by submitting an exclusive query. And I just put that in the subject line of my query letter. And so I said, hey, I did submit an exclusive, and if I don't hear back from you in the next couple weeks, I'm going to start submitting to others. And he responded immediately and said, hey, I'm reading it, give me a little bit. And then I want to say it was maybe that next week that I got an email, and he said, hey, Scott, I think this needs a little work. Maybe he didn't even say a little. He probably said, this needs some work, but I do want to represent it. And so that was in 2015, and I was like, man, I've got it made. I'm only going to have to work for I was pretty naive at that point. I was like, I'm only going to have to work for a few more years until my book's out. I'm going to be able to quit and just be a full-time writer. Since then, I have learned a lot more about the economics of writing, and maybe even in particular, traditional publishing. And I have since been viciously disabused of that notion that I will ever be a full-time writer. Although I kind of am now, I guess, but not because it pays well. But
all right,
yeah,
so you got the agent.
Yeah.
Step 2. Okay.
So I worked with Matt and his assistants to revise the book quite a bit. I don't remember exactly how many rewrites and edits I did with him, but at least 1 to 2. We went on submission in early 2019. No, I'm sorry, 2017. Early 2017. So I signed with him, I think late 2015. We went on submission, maybe even late 2016. No, it was mid to late 2016. So roughly a year, maybe 9 to 12 months later, we went on submission to 9 different publishers. We got 3 rejections, 4 rejections. 3 of them were very nice and sent the rejection with a little note, or even in one case, a long note saying, hey, I didn't connect with this, but I think it's good, and I think you can make X, Y, and Z better, right? And one of them was just a no. They didn't send anything back, which I get. But those 3 that rejected and did send notes back were all somewhat aligned in that they felt it needed to be quote unquote tightened. And so my agent said, hey, we still have this opportunity with these other 5, and then we could go to smaller presses, but these 5 were still, the big publishers. He said, we still have this opportunity. What we can do is pull the submission. We can tell them that we're working on these things that have been mentioned, and even the ones that had turned us down. He thought we could resubmit to a few of them and not, put his relationship with those editors in jeopardy, I guess.
Yeah.
Because that's what it really comes down to. So we did that. I edited for about 6 months. During those 6 months that I was editing, an editor from Orbit, actually named Kelly something or another, she reached out to Matt and said, hey, I finally got to this or whatever, and I'm interested. I want to see it when he's done editing. Well, a month or two or however many months later, before I was done with the edit, she quit the industry. If I remember correctly, she went to do an MBA at like Berkeley or something.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah, well, crazy and a huge bummer, because I was like, oh man, I got somebody who's interested in my book, and then they leave the industry. But Davy Pillai, who's now at Tor and is leading things at Tor, she was, and I'll get the positions wrong, but she was like the editorial director or whoever the boss of the editors is at a publisher, right? She was that, as far as I gather, at Orbit. And so she had been somewhat involved with this editor who had requested to see my book. And Matt knew or knows Davy and talked to her and said, hey, do you want to see this? She said, yeah. So we sent them an exclusive submission, basically just because they were the only one who reached out with strong interest, and Matt felt he could, get it placed better than trying to go out to all the ones who hadn't responded or the ones who had responded negatively, but they were still a big question mark. So Tor signed me pretty soon thereafter. That ended up being June of 2017. So it took at least a year from initial submission, pull it back, edit it, resubmit, sign contract. And then it's been a very long journey for both me and my editor, Jen Gunnels, who's fantastic, because they initially wanted to publish all three of this planned trilogy together, months apart rather than years. And I only had book one written. And I was like, well, if that's the only offer on the table, I can try. I can write these as fast as possible. But I've been writing this book since 2012, and and this is the only book I've written. I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it to learn how to write. So anyway, I was like, yeah, I'll try. But spoiler, that didn't happen. And by the time they were like, fine, we'll just publish it and we're close enough, right? And we'll move to a traditional spacing year apart-ish. I was scheduled to publish in 2019. And then I don't remember why we moved that time, but we moved from, I think it was September 2019 it was supposed to come out, and then it was moved to May of 2020, I think. And then the pandemic hit, and they were like, whole schedule scrapped, and you're part of the, the group moving to 2021. It was partially because they had picked up some larger books and they didn't want me going at the same time as some larger authors. But yeah, it was also due to the pandemic. So I was slid to end of 2021, and then they slid me again to when my book actually came out, which was just 18 days ago. They slid me to January 25th, 2022. And then right at the last moment, because of printing issues, they slid me to February 8th. So it has been quite a journey, very long time. Most of it's my fault. Some of it's the pandemic's fault. But yeah, it took quite a long time from starting and then to agent, then to signing a contract, then to actually getting a book on the shelves.
So then the general track, from what I'm understanding then, is going to be agent, submission, edits, launch.
Yeah, so I'd say with most agents, It depends, right? And this is part of where you kind of have to do your best to understand whether an agent is going to work with you in a significant manner on your manuscript. I chose Matt in part because some of his other clients that I had found online did say positive things about his editorial skills and willingness to edit and work on manuscripts before they went out. So I'd say, yeah, agent, edit, submission, if you get signed, which isn't a guarantee. I have some friends that got agents and then still haven't signed because there's very, very few slots. And the same thing applies. Very few people making decisions. There's a lot of subjective taste that goes into it, trying to match the market, personal mood on any given day that they see your stuff, budget, all that kind of stuff. And it's been a really weird world for the last few years, especially. So yeah. And then, sign on with the publisher, then edit, then hopefully launch. And there are a whole bunch of things in that edit bucket, right? With a publisher.
Yeah.
We could go into those if you want, but I think you're probably pretty familiar.
Yeah. So the next questions I have are for both your timeline and then also kind of what that path looked like. Do you find that that's pretty standard for a new author in the industry, or was yours a little bit more specific or different in any way?
Yeah, so I think where mine differed is most authors, it seems like, are smart enough to write a book and then move on, when they start writing, to write a book and then move on to the next and move on to the next and the next, and get a lot of experience under their belt that way. And I would honestly recommend that, whether you shelf it or whatever, even if you just throw it up on your blog. I don't care. It's cool to have it out there, and you'll probably get a following anyway, because I think there's more people looking for whatever you want to write than you might think, and it's a very long, slow burn to build up a following, from what I can tell. But yeah, I chose to just keep going with this story, partially in large part because it meant something to me, right? Mm-hmm. Though I have wrapped it in a very commercial and purposefully, I hope, entertaining story, there are a lot of aspects in there, a lot of personal symbolism, I guess. I don't know if it comes through to every reader, but there's a lot of stuff in there that, meant something to me, and I wanted this story to be good. But partially just because I am very stubborn and hate giving up on on anything. So that certainly took longer, I think, from writing to agent, and then probably from getting I'd say that's pretty typical to take probably at least a few months, up to 6+ with your agent, if they're a fairly editorial agent. And it depends on how quick you are with edits and all that kind of thing, scope of edits. I think my situation with my publisher was very different. So I think most of the time when you sign with a publisher, within ballpark a calendar year, you'll be publishing, right? Because that calendar year usually accounts for time to edit with your editor, and theoretically there's only 1 or 2 rounds of that, and then copy editing and proof editing and all that kind of thing can happen within that calendar year. In my case, it was like 4 years, and as mentioned, it was because they wanted to launch all 3 at once. I was very, very incapable of writing to that at that speed, and especially since I signed the deal right at a time when I had gotten a whole bunch of rejections, and that editor had left the field that wanted my book, and so I was pretty down on my chances of getting in. So I had picked up extra stuff at work and was working a lot of hours, and I was trying to build a tech startup on the side too. So I had just had a kid. So yeah, I had picked up a lot of stuff and a lot of responsibility that made that a lot slower than I would have liked. But also I think I'm just a slower writer, honestly. I agonize a lot. Doesn't matter if I'm drafting or editing or whatever. I rewrite as I go a lot.
That sounds very familiar to me. I'm very much the same way.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump back to our drink. So in every single episode, we always talk taste and smell because in writing, they're the most overlooked senses. So with this Laphroaig, what is it you're picking up? What are those smells, those tastes, those sensations? What's coming across to you?
Well, we went with Laphroaig, so it's mostly smoke.
Yep. And you said you have the Select, right?
Yeah, and I think that's just like a cheap mix, right?
Is it? I don't know. I haven't had the Select before.
I think it's like their, whatever their makes a whole bunch of not so aged barrels. It was actually, this Laphroaig was one of the first bottles I ever picked up, like way long ago. I have since, migrated to, I think my favorite scotches are, as far as peated goes, we talked about this, but Lagavulin 16. I really just like the kind of the ambrosia flavor and the little bit of brine as well as smoke. And then Glenlivet 15. I think it's called like the French Oak Reserve or something. But that's like that's the sweetest scotch or whiskey in general that I've had. I'm far from a connoisseur, right? I don't know a whole bunch about scotch or especially bourbon, but it doesn't have that. I can only describe it as a resiny taste to me. Bourbon has kind of a resiny taste that I really don't like. I'm not a huge fan of bourbon, and I've found that it's not often present in scotch. It is in some, but it's not in like this Laphroaig. I don't even know what I'm tasting other than smoke, honestly, with this one. But at least in that Glenlivet, it's a pretty clean, sweet taste, at least to my palate.
Yeah, that resin might be the difference because bourbon has to be a new barrel, a new oak barrel, whereas Scotch is using used barrels. So some of that resiny flavor is coming out and is basically getting spent in the bourbon. And then by the time those barrels get to Scotland, they're a lot more mellow.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up the Lagavulin because I'm kind of the opposite. So like Laphroaig and Ardbeg are of the Islas, they're my go-tos. Because for me, I love sweet whiskeys. I love Irish whiskeys. I'm very much like the big kind of stewed fruit, spicy kind of Christmas spices type Scotch or whiskey. I love that. But if it's smoked, I like it super dry, super briny, super salty, not a lot of sweet at all. And so that's what tips me away from Lagavulin a little bit, because Lagavulin's delicious, but a little too sweet for how much smoke it has, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
But it's funny. People seem to fall on either side of the fence with that.
Well, and I mean, I haven't had this Laphroaig for a while, and I want to say I haven't had it since I've, really developed a more sophisticated whiskey palate. And I'm actually quite enjoying this. I do like the level of smoke, and I guess there is a little bit of brininess, but you're right. It is not sweet like Lagavulin, but I like that. I definitely have a sweet tooth.
It reminds me a little bit like Lagavulin versus Laphroaig reminds me a lot of, obviously they don't taste anything like drinking white wines, but it very much feels like the difference between a really dry white, which would be like the Laphroaig, versus a little bit sweeter, more rich, like maybe a Riesling or something like that for the Lagavulin. Yep. Just that rounder, fuller flavor with the Lagavulin and the drier, tighter flavor with the almost more astringent with the Laphroaig.
I would agree. Yep. Absolutely.
Okay, so let's jump back to our topic and let's go all the way back to the beginning once again. So when you were setting off, was traditional the only route you were going to take, or was self or indie publishing on the table for you?
That's a good question. I was pretty set on traditional publishing for a few reasons. One was I didn't quite understand exactly what that meant, and especially in my case would mean in terms of, ROI on effort, especially. But also, I think I'm prone to seeking credentialism more than I probably should. But I'm also I attempt to at least be somewhat self-aware. And the part that scared me the most about becoming an author or really doing anything, as mentioned, I had a failed attempt at a tech startup in that same time period that I did with my very good friend and one of my brothers. The part that's always scared me the most is like that initial traction, and I guess for lack of a better term, a blanket term would just be marketing, quote unquote. And I've never been super comfortable promoting myself. I've never been super comfortable trying to like build a gathering, and I'm not necessarily trying to call anybody out, particularly not that we know, right? But there are authors and business owners and whoever else that are very, very promotional, right?
Yeah.
Like they obviously do not have a problem with that. And there are other authors who are so much better at like the community building aspect than I am. Like just making, like making a large group of genuine friends. Like I'm not good at that. I'm good I'm better. I don't know if I'm good, but I'm better at making a small group of friends. And I hope at least having, a deeper connection with a smaller group of friends, but that's just my comfort level. Right.
Yeah.
So I knew there was going to be a trade-off financially and in terms of control. And that's hard because I really like control and I really like money. But I also knew that I figured I was entering into a symbiotic relationship, and I think that's a pretty good descriptor for it. And I was going to give it a very, very good shot before I gave up on it, right? Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think I just got lucky. I got the first agent I queried. Who knows how it would have gone if I didn't, because I had a pretty short list of agents I was planning to query. If those, 3 to 5 that I really liked said no, who knows? And then if the, 10 to 20 past that I liked and was willing to take a shot on said no, I probably would have self-published and moved on. I don't know.
So let's talk a little bit about expectations. So thinking about what you had in mind stepping into the traditional publishing world versus what actually shook out. Do you find that, I guess, what's the ratio of met expectations to unmet expectations in that world?
That's a good question. And I laugh because expectations for me are not like a linear thing, right? Like I haven't always just had expectations set at a certain level and hoped that would be met. I'm constantly waffling, oscillating between hoping for the best and like seeing some of these authors that find an audience and a large audience and take off and have this awesome career, have all these fans that appreciate what they're doing and making a difference in their lives. And, obviously financial success follows that. And who doesn't like to get a paycheck, right? But at other times, it's just crippling self-doubt, like all of us. I'd say probably all creatives, right? I would
for sure.
have to think. But just a ton of self-doubt. And I think with writing in particular, since it takes so long to even get to the point where you can get that kind of feedback, and because it's not a thing, at least for me, I don't feel like I have avenues to get like a ton of in-depth feedback before it went out onto shelves, right? Like I've got beta readers, I've got friends who write and read and who have given me feedback, but one, you'd never know if you can trust what people say. But for another, like you could just have a group of friends with similar tastes and like, that's it. Nobody else likes it. So, I'd say, oh God, I'd say generally my expectations have more or less been met, with all the caveats we've already gone over of, timeline taking a hell of a lot longer than I would have liked. And again, that was mostly my fault. Some of it just uncontrollable circumstances as well. But the one thing that is a little bit difficult is that control aspect that I mentioned, right? Like, a lot of traditional publishing is more of a black box still to me than I would have expected. I mean, like, yeah. The biggest example right now, and I don't think I'll get in trouble for sharing this because it's pretty common, or common knowledge, or easily found out. So I don't have an audio version of my book yet, and that bothers me a lot because I like audio. I like audiobooks. And besides that, it's a very big channel. I've heard from some other, debut to mid-list type authors, which is where I kind of am entering the scene, right? Or at least hopefully get to. That audio is up to 50% of their sales. And that's a lot, and a lot to give up, because it seems like it's not that big of a deal to produce. And I would read it myself, and I will figure out sound editing. I'll hit up one of my very talented friends, in our own writing group even, to help with sound editing, that kind of thing. But there's just a lot, and it's not, it's not in control of any one person that I work with either. Like, my editor doesn't have control over that. And there's just a lot of moving parts that not only do you not have control, you just don't even have visibility into a lot of it. And the answers you get is just, well, we're trying, or, oh, be patient. And, assuming your book gets traction, that'll come, and we'll figure out an avenue for that. But in the meantime, it's very frustrating.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So of everything you've come across in this journey, what would be the most surprising element for you? The thing that you really came out of left field that you didn't anticipate or didn't think would be a thing?
Oh, man. The thing that surprised me the most? I'm gonna take this from an angle of, like, when I first started out, I would not have thought it would take me so long to get to the point where I was comfortable with my own work. And I say that in particular because even when I turned in my book, like, I edited this thing like dozens of times, right? And in they sent copy edits to me, and I got my hand slapped because I was like changing more stuff than they wanted me to change at that point. And like I was constantly pushing the boundaries on copy edits, on proof edits. So proof edits, they've already laid it out. They've done the layout, and they send it to you saying, hey, like, here are these things that our proofreaders have caught, which is awesome, by the way. Our proofreaders caught, like, maybe you repeated a word in a sentence, or something wasn't quite as clear as it could have been, which is awesome to have people telling you about before it goes out, right? But like, you're supposed to keep it in the same basic typeset or whatever. I don't know exactly what you even call it. You'd probably know better. But like, I was like crossing out whole sentences, and like crossing out paragraphs, and so yeah, I got in trouble a couple times on that. But yeah, I mean, I just never want to let it go, man. Like, it's really hard. It's really hard for me because I call it fear of failure. That'd be accurate. Call it perfectionism. That'd be accurate. But that's the thing that surprised me the most. I don't know, that I didn't see that coming.
Well, and when it comes to control, what part? So after the book got into the machine, what parts did you end up having a say on? So I'm thinking things like you mentioned that they had you switch your title, but like, cover art or back cover copy or things like that, was that totally in-house, separate from you, or did you have input with that?
Very good questions. So when it comes to the writing, there's a pretty clear delineation there, right? Everything on the writing and story side, I own, and that was made very clear to me, which I appreciate, right? Like even a couple times when I was asking for feedback, I was like, hey, what do you think about this? There was one time when my editor was like, Scott, at the end of the day, it's your book and you have to choose. And I was like, God damn it, just tell me what's the right answer, you know? So everything on the writing side, they always, you know, gave me full control, and I super appreciate that. They'll lean on you and they'll tell you, hey, I think this is the way you should go, or here's something that's not working for me or for us or whatever. But at the end of the day, they still trust you as an artist, and that's amazing, right? And there's kind of a middle ground. The middle ground was really the cover art idea, I guess, or inspiration. So my editor and I kind of put together like an inspiration board or whatever. Like she asked for it and I sent it to her with some description and ideas. And I'd say they did a really good job with the cover, especially given, you know, the general inspiration, I guess. I thought they did a very good job with that. Where I did not have nearly any control, and I don't know if this is because I'm brand new, or if it's like different editors consult to different levels on different things with their people or what. But I had very little control on the title side. So, I mean, they certainly consulted me and said, hey, what do you think about this? And do you have ideas for this and along these lines and blah, blah, blah. And we went back and forth quite a few times. But at the end of the day, it was the shot callers at the publisher who you know chose the title. They let me choose the series title, The Age of Ire, but they chose the book title, or at least heavily influenced it, and like the marketing copy and the blurbs, all that kind of stuff. They chose the like my bio on there. I mostly wrote, but they made a few changes before it went live. So yeah, I mean, like it's not even necessarily control that way that it was surprising and maybe a little vexing. I think that partnership was actually really good. And that's a lot of credit to my editor for putting up with a lot of bullshit from me, right? But the part that's frustrating, I don't think they even have a lot of insight to, and a lot of it is just because of how the industry is set up and all the things they have to navigate that have been set in stone way before them, right? And so that's things like you don't know your sales numbers until X number of months later, and whatever the industry calls returns, because you know they send out books out through a distributor, and distributor sends them to bookshops, and those bookstores can then something just fell over in my kitchen. Those bookstores can then return for with no penalty because of how the industry has negotiated those deals well into the past. And there are good reasons for that, but it's difficult, right? Mm-hmm. And there are all sorts of different relationships between publishers and their parent publisher, or their parent companies, that determine things like, you know, what editions get made or don't get made, and where is it distributed or where isn't it distributed? Are we running ads or not? Are we sending out physical ARCs or just e-ARCs? You know, how much effort are we putting into sending this author to trade shows, or, you know, with librarians and booksellers, or are we sending out pitch packets? Are we doing custom materials that we're sending out anywhere? That kind of thing. So it's really the business side, I think, that's a little frustrating for me, because I like that side. And not only do they not want you messing with that side, I don't think they have a lot of power to do much about any of the decisions being made. And so they can't, when I bug them about it, they're like, just chill, man, just go write a book.
All right, so let's jump back to our drink real quickly here. If you're willing, I'd like for you to do a little world building for us. So, thinking about your nice glass of Laphroaig, either for yourself or maybe for a character from your book, or for any sort of character, what is the perfect setting to enjoy this drink?
This drink, I'm gonna go with a stone castle in front of a wood fire in a very large fireplace, probably in a leather upholstered chair with a leather footrest, probably some tapestries on the wall for a little warmth. I'm gonna go with that, in part because my own book features some settings quite a bit like that, but that would be a pretty fun, maybe like some well-worn wood flooring. That'd be nice.
Yeah, this is definitely a cozy drink for sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, Scott, what sorts of tips, tricks, suggestions, cautions would you give people who are wanting to dip their toes into the traditional publishing world?
Prepare for pain. And I would target and try to get on a personal level with everybody involved as much as possible. So that's a little hard right now with conventions not being in person and that kind of thing. But what I think you can do is really look into who an agent, and I'll focus on agents because that's really the part you can control and approach. Look for agents who really do represent authors like you in terms of what you're producing, and try to be as honest as you can about that, right? And then try to do something to stand out. I know a lot of writers do just get in through the slush pile, and that works. But if you can send, and this will make it take a lot longer, right? But if you can send an exclusive query, put that in the title, no guarantee that garners more interest, but it can't hurt, right? I don't think a lot of other subject lines are coming in with the title exclusive query, for one. If an agent is doing and I don't know how to say this in German, but coffee clash, however you say that. Oh yeah. If they're doing that kind of thing, or if they're at a workshop, or if they're doing whatever, it doesn't hurt to see if there's an affordable way to at least get some personal time with them, or at the very least, even if they don't see you and they don't get some name recognition with you, at the very least seeing them and how they interact with the world and interact with other people might give you an idea of, for example, whether they're open to humor in the query, or whether they're all business, whether they care about how this is going to be marketable to a certain segment, or whatever that they're passionate about, right? So I think a lot more personal research is merited, not only because I think that improves the chances of getting an agent, but because it improves the chances that you'll actually like your agent. And you're going to be stuck with them, like if you sign a deal and they go sign it, that book forever is represented by them. That's the agreement you sign. So yeah, you want to make sure that you like them.
Absolutely. Well, all right, Scott, it is last call here at the Indie Pub. Can you give us an indie published book or 2 or 3 that you want more people to check out?
Well, I said I wasn't going to cheat, but I'm going to anyway. So your very own radio, I don't think gets nearly enough attention because it's a super, super cool premise. And I happen to know that you, like me, are very detail oriented and a perfectionist. And besides, your cover is freaking badass. And I know that was in large part due to your wife's skills, right?
Absolutely, yeah. She's fantastic. I super lucked out in that department.
Yeah, I am all about very talented significant others and making the most of that. But another, and I have to call out KM Alexander, right? A good friend of both of ours. Even better friend of yours. You guys have traveled with him and know him in person. I've only ever.
Oh yeah, he's the one who got me into the writing game in the first place. So yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, and I mean he's like an OG of the indie published game, right? And he's done rather well, and he has a very, very good skill set for doing all that yourself. That was another reason I went traditional. Like I suck at anything visual. Like there was just no prayer I was going to be able to design or probably even direct design on any good cover. But the last one I'll mention is a guy, an author I just met on an online writing group that I was recently invited to by some other writing friends. His name is Thiago Abdalla, and his book, A Touch of Light. A Touch of Light. It's a really cool cover for one thing, a cool tree with orange leaves or blossoms. I can't quite tell. But I had a conversation with him recently. He's from Brazil, where I lived for 2 years. So that was kind of a fun connection. And I think his book is just releasing here soon. And he's sent out copies to a whole bunch of people I've been seeing on Twitter. I unfortunately do not have a copy yet. But yeah, it looks cool, and according to all the reports I've seen, it's quite a good book. So there you go. There's your three to go check out: KM Alexander's Bell Forging Cycle, Jay Rushing's Radio, and Thiago Abdalla's A Touch of Light.
Well, I appreciate the shout out. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
All right. So same question, but for any other media, indie or not.
Any other media?
Just what are you into right now? What's really floating your boat?
Yeah, so I'm pretty, as mentioned, I'm pretty mainstream. I'll just throw out a couple quick mentions of visual media, then I'll go to traditionally published books that I don't think are getting enough attention. So visual media stuff I've really been enjoying lately. Peaky Blinders, the last season is about to come out. And I'm not sure, I know it's very popular, but I'm not sure enough people watch it because of the goofy name. But it is such a good show. Like, goddamn. I remember when so for those people listening, Jim and I have belonged to a small writing group for how many years now? 5+ probably?
Probably, yeah. It's been a while.
Yeah. But this is the first time we're meeting face to face.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. So this is really cool for me. But yeah, I remember when you, Jim, watched the first episode for the first time and you were like, that's as close to a perfect first episode as I've seen. And I was like, exactly. And I've been trying to tell people this, and I've got a lot of people to watch it, but yeah, especially if you like that kind of darker hero, anti-hero in one kind of story, man, I love that show. One that surprised me, a show that surprised me with how much I like it, was Succession. I started watching that, and for the first several episodes, I was confused and my wife was confused about what we were even watching. Like I couldn't tell if it was supposed to be a comedy or a drama or what it was, but I just loved it. I knew, I just wanted to keep watching. And ever since, I've been glued to it. And I've been so stoked for every episode that's come out. Tom Wamsgans and Greg are just freaking hilarious. Anyway, so Succession, highly recommended. And just a few traditionally published. I'll go to ones that are already out because the ones that are coming out, I'll shout out about probably here in the future. But Ryan Van Loan's The Sin and the Steel came out like right when the pandemic hit, and we share a publisher, so he was published by Tor as well. And so much of what they had planned to promote that book was shelved and it ultimately, canceled because the pandemic went for longer than any of us thought, I think. And then, he's just kind of been trapped in this pandemic hell with his entire trilogy coming out. So The Sin and the Steel by Ryan Van Loan. And then The Last Watch by Jenny Duez. I think it's Duez. I suck at pronouncing names that I've only read before. But she publishes under J.S. Duez or Dues. I'm not really sure. But The Last Watch is a sci-fi that is just superbly paced. I absolutely loved it. I tend to get like with deeper stories and longer stories, I don't know if I have like undiagnosed ADD, like my brother, or what, but like I tend to drop out quite a bit and take a long time to get in and then out and then back into a story. So I really appreciate shorter and quickly paced stories like The Last Watch. But it has a really cool premise too, with an advanced civilization with like kind of these I don't want to say Atlantis-esque gates, but like these gates that allow them to travel out to the edge of the universe, which is really neat. So yeah, there you go. Those two.
Nice. All right, Scott, tell our listeners what you have going on and where they can find you and your work.
I have The Rise of the Mages going on. It's been out for like 18 days. I am still obsessively checking Goodreads. So if you read it, please go leave a review, but only if it's good. I am currently finishing up revisions on book 2. I will withhold the tentative title because I don't know if that's going to stick. But I'm super stoked about book 2 because it's gone from book 1, where it's pretty pure action adventure, to book 2, which is more closely resembles a Bernard Cornwell, like a Last Kingdom type book, where it's very conquest oriented. And I'm super stoked about it. And people can find me on Twitter mostly at the Drakeford. I'm too active, if you ask my wife especially. I'm too active on Twitter. And you can find my blog at scottdrakeford.com. I don't write a whole lot of blog posts, but when I do, hopefully they're okay.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Indie Pub. If you like what you hear, consider giving us a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our indie investigations or boozy banter. I've been your host, Jay Rushing, and we'll see you back in the pub next time.